Bem-vindos a esta conferência do Instituto de Conferência do Ispa, com o professor Timo Van Canegem, da Universidade de Ghent e da Universidade de Bruxelas. É professor da Universidade de Bruxelas e é investigador, portanto, na Universidade de Ghent, e que vai falar precisamente sobre um dos temas em que ele tem investigado nos últimos anos, que tem a ver com a retenção escolar e os efeitos que essa retenção escolar tem nos alunos, embora aqui seja do ponto de vista dos professores, portanto, o processo das crianças, portanto, associadas à tomada de decisão por parte dos professores. Timo, thank you very much for being with us and for accepting the invitation to be here. And I made a brief presentation of you in Portuguese, but I don't say anything that you don't want to hear, so can be comfortable with that. So, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being here.
Does it work? Yeah, it works. Bom dias, was that correct?
Whatever.
Almost. Yeah, Portuguese is a difficult language, but I will do it in English if that is okay for you. So my name is Timo Van Canegem. I am a postdoc at Ghent University, and I also work as a guest professor at the Vrije Universiteit Brussel. I mainly work about grade retention or grade repetition. Is there any one of you who does not know what it is? You can raise your hands if you don't know it. Everyone knows it? I'm not surprised because both in Flanders and in Portugal, grade repetition or grade retention often happens. I do my work with my two colleagues, Professor and Professor Nanny de Manet. We are three sociologists of education, so that's quite a bit different perspective that most of you will apply. You're all psychologists, so we mainly look at the individual and what happens with the individual. We look bit from meta, from above, so I think those two perspectives are quite a good combination to understand what happens in the educational field. What is grade retention? It's a bit strange that I have a definition for it if you know it, because it is so self-evident for people from Portugal, from Flanders. But if I speak with colleagues from Sweden or Norway or Japan, they do not know what I am talking about. They look at me like the cow looks at the station, they don't know what it is. So what is grade retention? Grade retention is the practice of requiring a student who has been given grade level for a full school year to remain at that level for a subsequent school year. We apply it in case of academic underperformance, for behavioral issues, if someone is sick for a long time, so for long-term absence. Seems quite evident, but there's actually a lot of variation in the way that grade retention is applied internationally. In the frequency. Some countries use it very often, in other countries it does not exist or is quite rare. So grade retention always is entangled in a system, in an educational system. So if you do not want to have grade retention, you actually need to renew your educational system. So it always stands in line with other measures in an educational system. Some teachers use grade retention as a form of extrinsic motivation. They believe that children are not intrinsically motivated enough, that they need to stick to motivate students to learn their curriculum. And grade retention is also a differentiation mechanism. So what does this mean? Some people believe that it is better to have a homogeneous class group in front of you, that it is better to teach in front of a group where all people more or less have the same capacities. So what happens? The student does not have capacities that are good enough, the student is retained, and the classroom of the student remains homogeneous. So grade retention as a differentiating mechanism. In Belgium and Portugal, it's a highly normalized practice. We know what it is. It's something that people have feelings about, emotions about. If I talk about grade retention with teachers, I can often see in their faces what they think about grade retention. If they look at me very angry, then they do not like what I am saying about it because it is so central to their pedagogical ideas, about their emotions. So it is something very important in our systems. In other systems, it's different. We apply full grade retention, so that means if you're failing for history, You're also retained for French, or for Portuguese, or for English, so we do it for all courses. In the UK or the USA, it's a form of partial grade retention. That means that you can be in a high ability for some courses and a low ability for other courses. So that's a different form of grade retention that we do not actually know. Sometimes grade retention is a sole measure, so there is no alternative intervention besides grade retention in case of academic underperformance. Sometimes it's with tutoring or school courses or re-examinations. So actually grade retention, if you think about it, if you see it from an international perspective, it's quite dynamic. It changes from country to country. It's not the same everywhere. And teachers have difficulties to understand that because, yeah, they grow up in a system, they have school in that system, they become teachers in that system. So it's very difficult to look above the wall to see what another educational system looks like. How grade retention could be different, how a system without grade repetition could actually even exist. Some people look at me like, yeah, Norway does not have it. How do they do that? So they do not know what alternatives there are. Because as a person, you grow up in that system and you use the tools that you know as a person, of course. That's how people's cognition actually works. If we look at it internationally, I made a beautiful graph, then you see that variation coming alive. So if we would organize a world championship in grade retention, Belgium would almost be world champion, so we're good at something besides cycling, but Portugal would follow closely. If you see Belgium behind Luxembourg and Colombia, then it's Belgium, and then Spain and Portugal. So if you look at the numbers, especially in Belgium, about a quarter to a third of all students is retained at least once. Portugal is following closely behind. But if we walk across the other side of the graph, and you see Norway, none. Japan, none. Iceland, in the whole of Iceland, there's maybe 50% people who have been retained. So it's a very rare practice in countries like Iceland. What is interesting, if you open up Google Scholar and you type in grade retention, it's often Belgian studies, Portuguese studies, Spanish studies. So you could say, in order for us to study unicorns, there should be a unicorn around. So if grade retention is very prevalent, if it's a normal practice, it gets studied. It's very hard to find Icelandic studies on grade retention, and actually that's a pity. That's something that I look on, or that I study. Grade retention in Iceland, it's a cue for later on in the presentation. Grade retention in Iceland may be a fundamentally different experience from grade retention in Belgium. If you're one of the so many people that is retained, it might be less of an increasing, traumatizing experience. But if you're retained in Iceland, physically speaking or metaphorically speaking, you're the only person in that school to have been retained, the experience could change totally. So that's why it's interesting and important to see how the international variance is actually looking like. I must say that I have lied a little bit to you because I show numbers of Belgium, but in the educational world, Belgium does not exist. What has happened in the end of the 80s, it became a community topic. So it's the communities that actually decide upon educational policies, no longer the nation. If you divide Belgium into three parts, we have a Dutch-speaking part, where I am from, that's Flanders. We have the Southern-speaking community. Does anyone know what the name of the community is? It's Wallonia. And then we have about 3 villages that speak German, and that's the German-speaking community. So we are the country the size of a postcard. We speak 3 languages, and we have 3 communities. We also have 3 ministries of education and 3 ministers of education. In total, we have about 7 governments. Are you still following? So it's a complex material, which makes it very interesting. But grade retention, even in one specific country or one specific community, it's not the same throughout all years. It varies a lot from year to year. It's especially very frequent in the 5th year of secondary education. So if you're about 17 or 16 years old, you have a high chance of being retained. In the 6th year or the last year before university, it's pretty much non-existing. It's a way lower frequency. So what happens? It seems that teachers are a bit more sympathetic towards people at the last year of their secondary education, in contrast to the 5th year of secondary education. So in the 5th year, we have the most retainees, In the last year, we have the lowest amount of retainees. So if we combine all those numbers on a year-to-year basis, at the age of 15, about 20% is retained at least once in Flanders. If we look at Wallonia, the southern part, it's a third, which is even more. But in Flanders, we are already at the doubling the UCD average. And it costs a lot of money because, yeah, grade retention is an educational intervention that costs money. If someone is sitting in the seat in secondary education 1 year longer, of course, yeah, the government has to also pay for it, and the person on that seat is not working, not contributing taxes, etc., etc. Difficult to estimate, but if you do it conservatively, if you look at some things that we can measure, it's already 300 million euros a year for the Flemish education. Important, because if you think about grade retention as a software intervention, a computer program that you can use to improve cognitive improvements or cognitive outcomes, to improve reading or math or science, it costs 300 million euros a year. And for such a budget, you would expect it to be a very efficient computer program, I believe. I do not have 300 million euros lying around, I don't know about you. If so, congratulations. In Flanders, it's also a very specific context because teachers have a lot of autonomy. It's mainly the teachers that decide which students are retained and which aren't. So it's a teacher that is the gatekeeper. Teachers standing in the gate, deciding you can pass, you cannot pass, you can pass. Sounds logical for you, I know. In many other countries, it's a score on standardized tests, it's the parents that decide, but in our system, it's the teachers that are mainly the gatekeepers. They decide who retains and who doesn't. If we look at Portugal, I was quite surprised. The numbers are similar, that I knew already. 27% of 15 years old retain at least once. Those data are a bit outdated because Portugal has a program to decrease the number of retainees, but I could not find the most recent number, so it will be decreasing. But I already expect that a lot of teachers will be against those top-down improvements or top-down policies, that they actually are quite optimistic about grade retention and that they do not like that the policy level is pushing something against their will. So we will see what happens. But in Portugal, like Flanders, there's a teacher council, so it's a collective decision-making process where teachers gather at the end of the year or throughout the year, and they decide together, okay, this student has two courses that were not well enough, is the person going to retain or not? And that's exactly the same as what happens in Flanders, so you could say that Portugal is the Flanders of Southern Europe, or that Belgium or Flanders is the Portugal of Northern Europe. It does not matter to me, but there is actually a very interesting analogy or simultaneous process between those two countries. So there are people for grade retention, there are people against grade retention, but if we want to have a good idea about grade retention, we need to look into the numbers. We need to know what the science says. In the past it was difficult because there were a lot of studies, but those studies were not combined into a meta-analysis. What is a meta-analysis? It's an analysis of all analysis. So it is actually bundling everything that we know and seeing what pops out is the process. And the outcome is the outcome of the meta-analysis. Grade retention research, you can actually regard it as a tree with two branches. One branch is cognitive research, which is learning outcomes, reading, math, science. The other branch is very heterogeneous, very disciplined, and that's the non-cognitive branch. What is it? Everything else. So psychosocial consequence, behavioral consequences, everything that is not cognitive is per definition non-cognitive. Where are you on the labor market? Do you get the certificate or not? So that is the branch where I am mainly in. I am a sociologist. I will mainly focus on the non-cognitive branch. It's an analytical distinction because, of course, cognitive and non-cognitive factors are often intertwined. Learning something makes you happy. If you're happy, you learn better. So it's always interesting to integrate both perspectives into the study. And if you want to see grade retention as a software program, if you want to have a balance in favor or against, you need to actually know the cognitive outcomes and combine them with the non-cognitive outcomes. For instance, it could be that grade retention actually works but that people feel worse after being retained. You put those two in the balance, you see what pops up, and then you have an idea about what to do with great retention as an intervention. The research field is quite old, almost 100 years, and there's a strong growth of studies in the last 20 years, because we already have a lot of statistical expertise. There's actually an exponential increase of studies on great retention, which is very interesting to witness. In the past, great retention was already talked a lot about in Belgium and Flanders. It's part of the public debate. Should we abolish it? Should we maintain it? And it was always said, yeah, but it's very difficult to actually say something at the end of the story. What is great retention? Is it positive or is it negative? We don't have meta-analysis on the field. But since 2021, I can say finally that's not true. We actually have two interesting meta-analyses. One is done by Ispa. So there is actually good work being done on rate retention, and now we have a good collective oversight of all those studies. We can know what great retention is and what it isn't, based on empirical evidence. The first meta-analysis was done by Dr. Mieke Roos, Dr. Joanna Pipa from Ispa, and by Professor Peixoto. More than 500 studies were looked at, and at the end of the story, the best studies were collected. 86 studies, if I am correct, 84. Those were the best studies in the field. You look at the evidence, what do these 84 studies say? Is it positive or is it negative? It's already interesting, I think, to know what the meta-analysis says. In fact, if we combine all these findings into one model, we have to say that at the end, in the long term, great retention has a net zero effectiveness. So it's not that if you are retained that your net score decreases in the long term, but it also does not improve. In fact, on average, not much seems to happen. Yeah, if great retention is a software program that costs 300 million euros per year in Flanders alone, we should not be very happy about it. So, not that much of a positive story. The second meta-analysis was done by a Spanish team, by Javier Valbuena and his colleagues. 42 studies that allow for causal inference, which means that you can speak about causality, which is quite rare in social sciences, because, yeah, what is an experiment? It's difficult to conduct in the educational world and in the human world by large. What does Valbuena and his colleagues say? Well, that it is hard to justify maintaining great retention as a practice because of its non-effectiveness in the long term. So, no net negative effects, no net positive effects, but a net zero effectiveness. So that is already quite a nuanced story. It's on average something that does not do a lot in terms of cognitive outcomes. Cognitive outcomes, one branch of the tree. Do you learn better because of great retention? In the long term, apparently not. But the other story is also interesting, the non-cognitive story. What happens with retainees in the labor market? What is their self-esteem? Are they happy at school? Do they feel like they are part of the school? How many friends do they have? Do they lose friends because they are retained or not? So that is my branch. I don't look at the cognitive aspect, but I integrate it in the studies. I account for it, I control for it, but it's not my focus because I am a sociologist. Then we can see actually lots of questions popping up. Because the branch is so heterogeneous, there's a lot of factors into that branch, so the questions can go into all directions, which makes it a different field, I think. Some people believe that the non-cognitive effects are positive because of the big fish, little pond effect. That means that the fish who is retained changes the pond, or the fish stays actually in the pond, but the other fish in the pond change. All the other fish go to a new pond, and the younger fish enter the same pond that the retained fish is still in. So what does the fish in the pond see? Younger, smaller fish, and the retained fish actually feels larger because of the experience of being retained. Is that clear for everyone? What I mean by it? Big fish, little pond effect? Okay. Other people believe that the fish still compares to the fish that previously were in the same pond. That the fish does not forget magically about the other fish, but that it still thinks about the fish that are still swimming in the new pond. That it not only compares himself or herself with the new fish, but also with the older fish. That comparison process is essential to human nature. We always compare ourselves to other people, we always want to know what happens. So is it positive or is it negative? I did my PhD about it, and on average we can say that the effects or the side effects of great retention non-cognitively are negative. People who are retained have a lower academic self-concept, they feel less like they belong at school, they have a lower number of friends, they are more likely to be victimized or to be bullied. So, a lot of different outcomes, but if you combine them into a story, great retention seems to actually be harmful as an experience. I also contextualized it, because that's what sociologists like to do. I looked at, okay, the person in Iceland who is retained, is it a fundamentally different experience from the person in Belgium? Apparently, yes. So, the more people who are retained in a country, the less negative the effects are. Or the other way around, if you're retained in a country with a low number of retainees, all the negative non-cognitive side effects actually increase. So the person who is retained in Iceland has a bigger negative effect on academic self-concept than the person who is retained in Belgium, but the contextual effects are way smaller than the individual negative effect. So that's important. So a country could not say, okay, let's retain 100% of all students, and the non-cognitive effect suddenly increase to its positive effect. That's not true because it's small, but it's important because it's significant. So why is that? Maybe there is stigmatization, social isolation, or fish still compared to fish who are now in the new ponds. The fish does not forget about the new fish or the old fish. The comparison process turns out to be more negative than the big fish little pond effect actually thought so. But I have a correlational technique, so multi-level regression, so that is correlational, that is interesting, that is important, but it is not causational. It's very difficult because every person who ever conducts science or who ever lives dies. So, one thing that is very important, also for Ispa, I think, is that there is over-optimism among teachers about great retention. So, if I have a lecture like this for teachers, I feel that something is in the atmosphere, it's not love. People do not always like the outcomes of the meta-analysis. Teachers like to have, they see great retention, perhaps as one of the last sticks that they have, extrinsic motivation. So it's frustrating for them that a scientist pops up and says, hey, you should think about applying great retention because on average, in the long term, it has a net zero effectiveness. This has been studied by Santos and colleagues, also from Ispa. And what did Santos find? Well, great retention is actually central to the pedagogical ideas of teachers. So great retention systems like Portugal, but also in Flanders, I'm sure, actually goes to the core of what people believe about pedagogics because it is so fundamentally central to pedagogics. And the persistence of positive beliefs among teachers is actually against what science says. So the scientist says, yeah, net zero effectiveness in the long term, but the bulk of teachers is over-optimistic about great retention. But then the question is, what happens? Well, in the short term, there are positive learning outcomes. And that's what the teacher witnesses, because the fish stays in the pond together with the teacher, all the new fish come in, all the old fish go out, and the teacher sees the fish in the same pond. But what does not happen is that the teacher goes with the old fish to a new pond a year later, so the perspective of the teacher is limited. You see what happens in the retention year, but not what happens in 2 or 5 or 10 years. And actually it's logical that if you see the same curriculum matter twice, that you achieve better. That's a mere repetition effect. But in the long term, nothing inherently seems to happen. It's not that your magical wand improves math scores of people who are retained. Fundamentally, you stay the same person, but with non-cognitive side effects that are negative, if you look at it from above. So teachers, over-optimistic, science, not very optimistic. So there is a tension field. Then I say, okay, if scientists communicate this top-down and force it, to say it a bit plainly, down the throat of teachers, that will not go well, that will not bode well. We need to accept that teachers also have beliefs. We need to respect teachers, respect their autonomy. It's very interesting and important that teachers have autonomy. So I believe as a scientist that I should communicate bottom up what the science says, but then the teacher is the expert who should actually do based on the teaching expertise, what the teacher believes is best. So that is important. Communicating about the findings does not say that I will say what the teacher has to do. Does great retention reproduce social inequality? That's the next step, because I worked in my PhD, which was done 3 years ago, on the non-cognitive outcomes. Now I look at what happens in terms of social inequality. If we know that there are non-cognitive side effects, what happens with the determinants of great retention? Yes, allow me to explain. So does it reproduce social inequality? Apparently yes. I already gave the clue away. What happens? 3 to 7 times people who are retained, they are 3 to 7 times more likely to drop out of education without obtaining a degree. Comparison, same person, similar capacities, who has not been retained. So if you are retained, if you have to repeat the year, you're 3 to 7 times more likely not to obtain a certificate, not to get a degree in secondary education. In fact, great retention seems to be the most important predictor of dropping out early. So it defines your chances to not actually get a certificate, the most of all factors that we have studied in the literature study on great retention over the years. Not obtaining a degree in secondary education, that's of course a problem in a knowledge society because of several reasons. If you not have a degree, you have lower mental health outcomes, you are more likely to get a depression, your income will be lower, you will live less long, and even more importantly, the number of healthy years is substantially lower in your life. So if you have a degree, you can live healthy up until the age of 75 maybe. If you don't get a degree, the process starts way sooner. So not getting a degree really has real-life consequences. And then there is also, further on, something else happening. Randall Collins says that we live in a credential society. Today, if you don't have a degree in secondary education, some people will not regard you as a fully functioning member in our society, and it is also difficult, because of literacy problems, to really become a fully functioning member of society. It's becoming more and more difficult to just maintain a position in society if you don't have credentials. So great retention as an intervention actually leads to social inequality. It can start, but it will also reproduce, which I will talk about a bit in the future. This is a very sinister graph. Internationally, if you look, Flanders and Belgium are at the right side of the graph, which means that the difference between people with a migration background and without a migration background, in terms of likelihood of being retained, is the largest. What got my attention for Portugal, high number of retained students overall, but the difference between people with a migration background and without is considerably smaller than in our region and country. I do not know why, but maybe that is something that we could discuss later on. So I have no idea. If we look at it, who is being retained, we see a clear overrepresentation. Study after study shows that people with a migration background and people who have an underprivileged socioeconomic status, they are more likely to repeat the grades, even if you control for academic performance, misbehavior at school, and other factors. And that is something strange that you should understand and remember when you walk out the door. It's strange that people with a migration background are more likely to repeat the grade if you account for all other factors that we know about. That is not logical. It's a structural characteristic that you are born with that decides your chance of being retained, even after academic performance, misbehavior, language issues. So what is happening? That is the big question. That is the project that I currently study. Why? Why does socioeconomic status and ethnicity explains your chances of being retained? What is happening over there? And honestly, we do not know yet why that is the case. So that is interesting. Could be plenty of explanations, but you can only do so much in 3 years. So I have one potential explanation that I am exploring. It could be that teachers are implicitly biased, that they are not accounting for external factors. For instance, if you are in poverty and you go to school, some teachers will not know what poverty actually is, how it manifests itself, what actually brings about an educational system, and therefore it could be more difficult to sympathize with people in poverty, to understand their challenges. They could become more frustrated about the student, and at the end, the person with a lower socioeconomic status could have increased chances of being retained if you account for all the other factors. If you look at it statistically, people with a migration background or an underprivileged socioeconomic status have up to twice as much chance to be retained. So double the chances to be retained. That's considerable, that is a lot in fact, and it is very much so in Flanders and in Belgium. What is an implicit bias? Because it's often a concept that is a bit fluid, it's grasping in the air, it's very difficult to grasp what it is precisely. What is it? So I define an implicit bias based on the definition of the American Psychological Association. It is a set of negative attitudes of which one is not consciously aware against a specific social group. It is important that studying an implicit bias on teachers, it does not mean that you grasp one specific teacher out of the group and that you have to treat the teacher for his or her implicit bias. That's not what implicit bias research does. We see it as a collectively formed problem, as a societal problem that manifests itself in individual actions, but it happens on a societal level, not per se individually. So people have certain conceptions and ideas about race, gender, and other social categories. The attitudes change decision making. That is what I am studying currently. Implicit biases are common among people, and as far as I know, teachers are still people. So it's not that if you study implicit bias among teachers that you regard them as some monstrous behaviors, monstrous things. No, you regard them as people, you know that people are not flawless, and that is why you want to study an implicit bias in the educational world, I think. Think about the high teacher autonomy of Flanders, teachers as gatekeepers, and the relevance of the project becomes a bit clear, I hope. Especially in Flanders, teachers are mainly white and mainly middle class, so there is a very low number of teachers who grow up in poverty. We have a very low number of ethnic minority teachers, but lots of students growing up in poverty and lots of students with ethnic minority status. So the teacher stands in front of the students, knows the students, cares for the students in most cases, I'm quite sure, but not always understands what the student goes through. The teacher cannot always understand what it is like to grow up if you don't have electricity, if you don't have a study room, if you don't have a bed to sleep in. So it is very difficult to really understand what happens for such a person if you've not lived through it yourself. So the lived experiences that people go through, define your attitudes towards students. So I formulated some research questions. The first overarching research question is, the link between ethnic minority status and socioeconomic status and getting retained, is that because of implicit bias formation? That is the overarching question of the project. The first research question is if ethnicity and socioeconomic status actually lead to a higher chance of recommendation of grade retention. So if you are ethnic minority status student, are you more likely to get recommended to be retained? The second research question is if ethnic minority students and low socioeconomic status students actually are met by an implicit bias among teachers. So are the attitudes of teachers different towards a student that has either an ethnic minority status or an ethnic majority status? You have to think, the same student, the ethnicity differs, all the other accounts are the same. What is the different attitudinal ID of the teacher? Is there an implicit bias? And then the third research question, is there a link between those attitudes and decision making? You can be very much against people with ethnic minority status. You can have very strong attitudes on people from a low socioeconomic status, but not act on them. So there needs to be a link between those attitudes and the decision making of teachers for an implicit bias to be the explanation of what I am studying. Is that clear for everyone? Still speaking English, not Dutch? Okay. And then the last research question is if the teacher characteristics actually impact the attitudes of the teacher. So if an ethnic minority teacher with an ethnic minority status, has less implicit bias against ethnic minority students. Because the earlier ID, maybe that teacher knows what happens for people in that world, in the world of people of a vulnerable socioeconomic background has gone through the challenges that the student goes through. So the frustration may be less. So that is what I also study. Do the teacher characteristics have an impact on the implicit bias? The big question is how? Because that's very difficult to study, and always, if you want to study such a thing, it will be limited in some ways, because I cannot go directly into the head of the teacher and look what is happening over there, so you need to do it very indirectly, but I am sure as psychologists you are all aware of that. What I want to do, I have a mixed method research where I combine video vignettes with in-depth interviews. So the first part of the research that is currently happening is an online survey where the teacher fills in characteristics, attitudes, looks at a film of a short film of about 2 minutes of a fictive student, and then is asked, okay, the student is going through problems at school, what would you do with this particular student? Would you retain the student? Would you let the student study in the same program? What do you think that the problems of the student are? Why do you think that the student is underperforming? And then I can look, okay, based on the different answers on the vignette that the teacher saw, what is the difference? There are other video vignette studies, not in great retention research, but in some studies, teachers see 2 or 3 vignettes. I have increased my teacher population and I only show 1 vignette. So each student, each teacher, each respondent sees 1 vignette. Either a person with an ethnic minority status, ethnic majority status. Some vignettes have good language capacities, in others the language is not perfect. Some students have a low socioeconomic status, other students have a high socioeconomic status. So I show 1 film of about 2 minutes to each teacher. Because if you show the teacher 2, 3, 4 vignettes, I think that what you are doing becomes clear to the teacher, and then you're no longer studying implicit bias formation. In an ideal world, my respondents do not know what I am studying. Because if they know beforehand that I am studying implicit bias formation on ethnic minority students, yeah, they're not going to be totally honest. People never are totally honest, but that is of course a continuum. So I cannot let them give a hint of what I am actually doing. And then I do in-depth interviews with about 30 teachers who responded in the first phase, because I want to actually, if I see a teacher where the answers are very outspoken, I want to interview the teacher, not per se confront the teacher, but I want to gain more understanding of why the patterns were that way. So I can actually not only have the quantitative data, but I can also do qualitative interpretation of the data that I collected. The survey, this is a bit of an oversight of what the survey includes. That will be interesting for people who do research themselves, I think. So teacher characteristics, is there a teacher burnout? Is there an intention to quit the teacher profession? What is the teaching style of the teacher? Then I look at job satisfaction. Is the person happy to be a teacher, or is it all flowing up? And is the teacher going through a difficult period where the teacher has little time? Of course, we know if people have little time, if they are frustrated, then implicit bias formation will be more easily available. I think there could be an impact over there. Then I ask, okay, if there is a student underperforming, what is a possible cause for the underperformance? Is it because there is no discipline, because there is a lack of motivation, because of poverty, because teachers at the school are not qualitative enough? Then I see, okay, what are the common causes of school failure? And then I look at which criteria a teacher has to retain the student or not. Is it only academic underperformance, or is behavior taken into account, perceived motivation, perceived discipline? Because if teachers are gatekeepers, they stand in the gate and they decide who can retain or who can pass and who cannot. Yeah, gatekeepers will all be individually motivated, have individual ideas on what grade retention should be, and the criteria could also be different. Then they will see the video vignette, so one fragment of one particular student, so they do not know what the study is about, and they have to develop a remedy for the student. The teacher is shown either Arne, which is an ethnic majority name, or Amir, which is an ethnic minority name. Ambiguous school reports, 2 or 3 deficits, but not 25%, no, 42, 43%, 48%, 51%. So there becomes ambiguous. So it's not clear if the person should be retained or not, which leaves a lot of wiggle room for the implicit bias. because if it's not clear, the gatekeepers will act differently. Small decision differences, but big impact for the individual. So that is important that there is ambiguity over there. The student tells that it is a mentally difficult year, that he has gone through challenges, there's low confidence, as yes markers are different, either low, either high, and the language abilities differ as well. So I have 6 different vignettes, about 100 teachers per vignette. I have 56 schools that want to participate. They're not fully informed about the study topic. Of course, I had to go through ethical approval because that's not easy to do, but otherwise I could not study what I want to study, so I had to find a little bit of margin to do that. The sample size should be sufficient because then I can do multi-level logistic regression. For those who don't understand exactly what it is, it means that I can see different levels, what happens at the school level, what happens at the individual level. For instance, in some schools, teachers will be very prone to retain a student. In other schools, it might be a very stigmatizing decision to do that as a teacher. So what happens at the school level is also very important. Because I'm a sociologist, I contextualize. What does video vignette look like? These are from a previous project that I did. That was with general practitioners. I don't know if that's a common term. If you're sick, you go to a doctor, that's it. So the doctor has a vignette, either white patient or an ethnic minority patient with a depression. What happens? Does the doctor actually advise a psychologist? Does the doctor prescribe medication? What are the different patterns in the decision making of the doctor? So that's something that I do now, similarly, but in the educational context. So the vignettes will look something like this, but I will have 6 vignettes instead of 2. I will change clothing, I will change the markers of socioeconomic status, so this is what happens. Big question that pops up, why always males? Because I expected it with the doctors that there would be more negative feelings towards men with migration backgrounds, and now men are way more likely to retain grades than women. I think in another project it would be very interesting to see what the difference actually is between the same male student and the same female student. So gender should actually also be very interesting. Yeah, and clearly shown in video vignettes to also play a role. Why are males more likely to retain a grade? And is it if the factors are similar, perhaps it's something else, and woman pops up as more likely to retain a grade. So we don't know what happens over there. I'm almost at the end of the presentation. So the teacher sees the vignette, and then the teacher is asked to specifically rate the vignette or the student in the vignette. What do you think about the motivation from 1 to 100? What do you think about the discipline from 1 to 100? What do you think about the academic achievement? Was it good enough? Was it not good enough? It was always the same, of course. What do you think about the socioeconomic status? It's a rich student, or is it a student that struggles at home? How do you perceive it? And I can also assess if I correctly conveyed the markers of SES. I need to know that they actually perceive the SES the way I wanted them to perceive it. It's also a quality check of my own vignettes, of course. What did you think about the language capacities? Why do you think that student is actually struggling at school? What is happening over there? So first it's asked the teacher to assess common causes, and now the teacher has to apply these causes to that specific student. And then I can see the differences. Perhaps less discipline, less motivation than commonly assessed. Do you think there are familial issues for that student? Would you advise the student to retain or not? Would you do it in a current or a new program? Would you do additional interventions such as tutoring, summer schools, re-examinations? What would you actually do as a teacher if that student in the vignette was in your classroom? Then I go further. I ask what the expectations are of the student. Do you think that the student will get a certificate? Will that student go to university? What could that student do in the labor market? What would the labor market position be? Then I ask the grade retention beliefs. Do you think grade retention is an effective measure? Do you think it's a positive measure? What do you think about the non-cognitive effects? Does it increase academic self-confidence? Or does it decrease academic self-confidence? I ask this after the video vignettes, because if I asked it before the video vignettes, I would already prime their decision to retain the student or not. And then I ask if the teachers have been retained themselves. Perhaps in Portugal or Belgium it's quite likely that many teachers have ever been repeated themselves. Maybe that influences your own decision making as a teacher. Could be. And then I want a last quality check to assess the realism of the vignettes. How realistic do you think that student is? Is it played well? Was it played atrociously bad? Then I know I should redo the vignettes maybe. So that's something that I will check early on in the project. And at last, I ask if they want to participate in an interview for the second phase of the research project. If you can unravel the teacher implicit bias, it's fundamentally interesting because I'm a fundamental researcher. I want to really unravel that black box. What is happening? Why socioeconomic status and ethnicity so important in grade retention determinants? What is happening in that black little box? Which mechanisms are at play? That is already interesting from a scientific perspective, but it's also very interesting as a society, of course, because discrimination. I hope that everyone in this room can agree that it is a bad thing that discrimination happens. And discrimination, if it would be happening, we should track it, we should map it, we should better understand it, in the hopes that as a society we could find ways to diminish the degree or the extent of discrimination in our society, in the educational world. What is interesting, I think, implicit bias as a concept, it's very in high spheres, but if you could actually find specific attitude differences, for instance, if teachers always assess the discipline of an ethnic minority student to be lower, we already have quite a specific measure of implicit bias. We already know a little bit, okay, it could be in that direction that the implicit bias is actually formed, is actually operationalized. So we can map the implicit bias to better understand it. And then I also want to see the impact of the school, of course. Which schools are retaining students a lot? Where is the implicit bias really high? So all schools that participate will get a report, anonymized of course. I'm not going to say, this teacher, you should look at the teacher. I don't expect that that teacher will be a good teacher. That's not the purpose of the project. And I can say to the schools, look, if we do look at all participating schools, they are somewhere over here, you're over here, so you could do something about it. There seems to be happening something that could be very informative for the schools as well, because I still believe that all school boards hope to be good schools, or that that is actually the idea that they would have to spread. One last thing, grade retention is often an automatic response in Portugal and Flanders alike. I think should we abolish it? Difficult to say because it's on average not a good idea, but we do still not know when it could be a good idea. So we could have a paradigm shift among teachers. Like they have to consciously think, okay, could grade retention be a good idea for this specific student? And why could it for that specific student be a good idea? And then you leave the autonomy with the teacher, but you already have a different idea on how to implement or use grade retention. The last slide, I promise. Teachers are important gatekeepers, of course, but the fact that they are in teacher councils makes it a collective decision-making process, which means that I could actually do 3 more years of research, which is very interesting because I like this topic, because it's not only an individual gatekeeper. No, in fact, the gatekeepers come together on a table and decide collectively what should be done about that specific student. And that's interesting because that collective decision making is very ill understood. It's not been studied before. It could be that some teachers are very dominant. Male teachers could be very dominant, for instance, or teachers who are very much against grade retention. They could actually try to dominate the conversation, or teachers who are very in favor of grade retention. What is happening in those teacher councils? How do these teachers collectively decide the outcome for the students? I want to sit in the teacher council, write down what happens, and do an ethnographic observation, because then you can really understand this collective nature of the decision making. Some schools use teacher councils every month. In other schools, it's only one time at the end of the year. I think if you do it very early on and a lot, the implicit bias could be less, because you have more way or more room to account for external factors. You could say, yeah, the student, he has a depression, or she has a burnout, or she's not feeling well, or the parents are separated. If you know that by December instead by June, yeah, the decision of the outcome process would be different. And if you have more time for a specific student, can and negotiate more. So I think something would be very interesting to study. And then I finalize my slides by asking if you have any questions or remarks. Thank you very much.